Hello, I am Ed Lee. I serve as the Senior Director of the Alvin W. Barkley Forum for Debate, Deliberation, and Dialogue here at Emory University. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth and final installment of the Presidential Debate Analysis with the Barkley Forum. In 1837, Emory College in Oxford, Georgia, placed the competition of ideas at the center of the student experience with the creation of the Phi Gamma Literary and Debate Society. And while debate formats have evolved and the makeup of the student body at Emory has changed in the 180 years of debate at our institution, the Barkley Forum continues to work to preserve Emory as a home for the deliberative exchange of ideas. At the heart of our effort really is a relentless commitment to fostering a campus culture that encourages research-driven argumentation, the expression of dissent, and the empathetic listening of countervailing perspective. At the heart of the Barkley Forum is a culture of questioning and debate. We are so committed to debate that we are even willing to get together to debate about debates. This gathering would not be possible without the contributions of the immensely talented debaters of yesteryear, who eventually comprised the alums of the Barkley Forum. We affectionately and rightfully call them our foundation, because they are the building blocks of all of our current and future successes. We are thankful that several current and future BF alums are joining us today to do what debaters do, to analyze and interrogate arguments. I want to thank Jesse Arnidis, the Senior Director of Development and Alumni Engagement, and Emory's Advancement and Alumni Engagement for partnering with the Barkley Forum to bring together this amazing collection of people to talk about last night's debates. Before I introduce you to the people participating in today's conversations, there's a little housekeeping that I need to do. One, both the chat and the Q&A are disabled for this session. Two, please feel free to email any post-event questions that you may have to the AAE email address that will be sent to you after this event. And finally, just to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. Now to today's participants. Cyrus Gavi. Cyrus is an Atlanta native, and more importantly, my former lab partner at the Emory National Debate Institute. Cyrus is currently an attorney for the National Football League, where he focuses on a range of corporate matters. Senator George S. Lemieux serves as the chair of the board of Gunster Law Firm and is the founder of the Lemieux Center for Public Policy at the Palm Beach Atlantic University. George served as Florida's 34th United States Senator in the 111th Congress. Dr. Rodney Jackson earned his MD degree from Mercer University School of Medicine, then completed the pediatrics residency at Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital after earning his undergraduate degree from Emory. After many years of practicing in DC, Rodney took his medical practice to Phoenix, Arizona. Maggie Wells. Maggie is a senior at Emory studying English and political science. After graduating in May, she hopes to be on her way to law school. Maggie is a member of the Barkley Forum's debate team, their dialogue organization, the Emory Conversation Project, and serves as the Barkley Forum's historian. Casey Walmer. Casey is the Senior Vice President and Counsel at First Key Mortgage, LLC in New York City. Casey is an avid fan of the Yankees and Star Trek and indoor cycling, and is a semi-retired marathon runner and triathlete. Now, on to our conversation and questions. After the first debate, there's a lot of clamoring about the desire and need for us to have mutings that would take place, the insertion of a button that could stop Joe Biden and President Trump from interrupting each other. People wanted a mute button. They received a mute button for last night's debate. How did that impact the debate?
I was a skeptic going into it, but I actually thought it worked pretty well. If nothing else, it seemed to serve as a deterrent to each of the participants from going into the other's time. There were a couple times where it was muted while someone was talking, and so I feel like that was a more helpful reminder that their time was up, as opposed to the moderator chiming in, which we've seen is completely ineffective because the speaker feels like they could just plow through the moderator trying to stop them. But if the mic cuts out, even it seemed to me that maybe they were even like cutting it out for a second and then putting it back on, that they realize if they don't wrap it up immediately, they're just going to lose their ability to talk. I was expecting President Trump to just continue talking even though he was on mute while Biden was talking, and to try and distract the vice president, even though the American people wouldn't be able to hear him. But that didn't seem to happen. So I thought it worked well.
I agree with Cyrus. I was also skeptical, and I thought perhaps there would be other mics that would catch either President Trump's or Vice President Biden's voices, even if they continued to talk over it despite being muted. And so I was happy that that didn't happen. And I think that it primarily served as a deterrent. It was helpful in kind of bringing out a little bit more substance than what happened in the first debate.
If nothing else, it allowed you to hear what Vice President Biden was saying. It was very difficult to hear anything Vice President Biden was saying in the first debate.
Other thoughts?
I thought the mute button caused Trump's team to work with him a lot in his facial expressions, because his facial expressions when Biden was talking were honestly great. I mean, I thought he handled himself really well. I was expecting so little from him, and maybe that's just, he always gets rewarded because the bar seems to get lowered in, formal events, because that's not his presidency. He's, the everyday billionaire man. I mean, however he spun it. But I just thought he handled himself so well. And if the juxtaposition was that Biden's facial expressions were Joe Biden. I mean, he was constantly the golly gee, rolling the eyes, oh heck, and he was very expressive, where Trump was, for lack of, it's funny that I'm saying this, he was very presidential in the way that he stood there and when Joe Biden was speaking. And I was very impressed with how he was put together. And I think his team either replayed video with him or actually showed him a mirror of his face while he was listening to other people talk, and really work with him on it, because I do think that I just do think he came across incredibly presidential in those moments. And if somebody is an undecided voter and wants somebody who's, strong in a situation and can, convey that sort of attitude, which I think, a lot of Americans do, I think he was effective, and I think his team did prepare him really well.
Yeah, I'll just sound off on that. I think Casey's right about that. And we should not be surprised that a sitting president, did poorly in their first debate, because we've got a very good track record of watching other presidents do poorly when they're up for re-election in their first debate. You will remember that President Obama got shellacked by Mitt Romney in that first debate. You'll remember that President George W. Bush got shellacked by John Kerry in their first debate. And part of this is that there is a natural arrogance to becoming the president and being the president. And then you feel like, why am I on stage with this other person? President Trump is an outside the lines guy anyway, so his conduct was just completely something we've never seen in the first debate. But whether he was now more willing to be coached, whether he realized that the first debate hurt him, he did a much better job this time. And this debate was much more like a normal presidential debate within the confines of the American experience that we've seen since debates have been televised since 1960. And it was, for me, much more comforting to watch a real discussion. I thought both of them came forward with ideas, made good points, had good counter arguments. And to me, it was refreshing after watching the first debate, which was a debacle.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Casey.
There were a bunch of moments where, like, as a former debater, you could tell where he had been coached by one of his senior staff, and you could draw a line. And as somebody who's follows the issues, probably too much. I could see what they had told him and how he had put it in Trump terms and how he had given himself a way to convey it and remember it. But exactly to the point of walking in arrogant the first debate and then realizing he needs to listen to his team and, and taking and listening to them and taking their advice. I mean, that's something that this president is not known to do. He's not known to admit when he's wrong, and he's not known to think anyone else is smarter than him or can give him good advice. And I mean, if he ends up winning this election, let's hope he continues to listen to people that do know what they're talking about.
Yeah, Casey, I think that's a really good point. In particular, when you said you can draw a line and where it happens, I noticed that very much in that it was the beginning of his answers. You could tell he was well prepared, well coached, and he was actually listening to it. But as the answers wore on, as he got later in the answer, it started to sound a lot more like the President Trump that we're used to hearing, where he's going off track a little bit, throwing in the ad homs and things like that. But it's no small feat with him to actually even get that first part done. So I was surprised to see that, and clearly a difference in previous debates.
One of the things that I noticed, and Casey spoke to this, were the nonverbals. And I think that this is, if we look at the three debates that have happened, including the vice presidential debates, those who are studying and focusing on nonverbal communications, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from there. And I think that it substantially improved the affect and the receptivity of his performance. Didn't change very much of what he said, but just the nonverbals and the presentational component of it radically changed the way in which people were talking about it.
Yeah, and then there was the leaking of the side profile shots, and that sort of had the Twitterverse, up in a tizzy about, and I think that was a reaction to it. I think that people who are not fans of him and who wanted Joe Biden to come out looking more presidential, that became their glomming on point, that his physical appearance. And I'm just never a fan of mocking his physical appearance. I just think it's so, beyond what we should be talking about. And I think Kellyanne Conway, I think that's always everyone's initial reaction to her. And it's like so beyond the pale of what we should be talking about when we talk about her as his advisor. But I think that really does prove that he did make a substantial impact and he did come across well, is because those side shots then became something to talk about. And it's kind of embarrassing that that's what the American public is talking about. And a side view of a man on a podium, like no one looks good on a side view on a podium unless you're like Gisele Bündchen, like give me a break. Like this isn't America's Next Top Model. This is the leader of the free world. So, and I mean, not for nothing, he also just recovered from COVID. Like that performance, that stature, and again, I can't believe this is coming from me, but like, I sat there and was like, holy heck, he might do this again. Like he might pull this off. I think people underestimate him, and it's not working out well for us.
He's always been tremendously underestimated. I'm a Republican. I did not support President Trump in the Republican primary, and I supported Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and folks like that. And then we all thought, oh, well, Trump will fall away. Like, he'll never make it. And it was a sort of there was a collective misunderestimation of Donald Trump. And then everyone was like, well, don't really attack him because you'll want his supporters. And eventually when it comes down to one or two people, then there'll be the Republican choice and the Trump choice, and the Republicans will win. And we all know how that turned out. So he was masterful 4 years ago in his debates, and he did suffer from what I would call the, running for re-election as president hangover in the first debate. But I thought he was very strategic in this debate. And, the first debate, Vice President Biden's expectations were so low because the president and his team had painted Biden as basically someone who couldn't string a sentence together. And this time, because of his own performance, and perhaps because he also suffered from COVID, the expectations on the president were so low. Even I did not think that he would get the counseling and the advice. I mean, the rumor, which I couldn't believe, but it proved to be true on the first debate, was that he didn't practice at all. I mean, he sat in a room with Chris Christie and Mayor Giuliani and kind of went over some talking points, but he didn't do what everybody else does in preparing for debates, which is go in a room, stand at a podium, have an opponent, and if that's true, it showed in the first debate. He obviously, to Casey's point, went through a lot of preparation this time and did a lot better and was a lot more composed.
There was also a moment in the debate that shook me to the core, was when Biden made a very, very, I thought, effective point where he said it's when it started to go into the Hunter situation. He said it's not about his family or my family, it's about your family, and had this whole painted picture of the dining room table and people not being able to make ends meet. And that was obviously coach prepared Biden talking point. I thought it was great. And I was like, cheering in my head. And I was like, how's he going to respond to that? And Trump's immediate response without skipping a beat was, this is political, this is politics. You're a politician, stop it. And that was masterful. And that I don't think was a coachable moment. And that's a way that I do think he is learning, because he is learning how to deploy his toolbox in ways that I did think that was effective. So he's coaching, but I do think he's evolving, and he's not my candidate, but I do think it's a little scary, because I do think that some people, that is the reaction that they want. When Biden starts talking about the dining room table, they're like, but you're rich now. Don't talk to us about our dining room table.
That was one of the episodes that I would sort of tease out, or snippets I would tease out of that debate as well, Casey, was that moment. And there were that I felt like Biden did not respond to as well at all. And sort of how do I reframe or counterframe this? The other was that there were a series of times when President Trump's response was, you have been in Washington, D.C. for 47 years. Why didn't you get this done before? Why didn't you improve the minimum wage before now? Why didn't you deal with climate change before now? Why didn't you deal with, and why do you think Vice President Biden had such a difficult time dealing with that particular line of argument?
Well, he did at the end, when he kept getting badgered, talk about the Republican Congress. And then Trump again was like, you have to do deals, Joe, and was so condescending. And it was good. I mean, if Biden really wanted to dig his heels in and talk about, what Republican leadership had done during Obama's administration, I think that would have been effective. But I also think that Joe Biden was effective when he talked about what happened in the 80s and how there was a unanimous vote. And he said his vote was wrong. And he said it wasn't just the crime bill in the 90s, but things had been set up. And we've had a fundamental misunderstanding of drug crimes, of incarceration, of how to solve these systemic issues. And I think we've learned exponentially in the past, maybe even just 20 years, how to deal with these issues. I agree with you, Ed, completely. I don't think he was as effective as he should have been on these points. And Trump point blank said, I ran because of Obama, which is so offensive and so not true and just beyond. And it is, somebody who likes Obama myself, it rubs me the wrong way, because Trump's whole birtherism was steeped in so much racism and awfulness. And it's really disheartening. But I do think that's like the fundamental disconnect. And I don't think either of them bridge the gap on that.
I was kind of surprised when this discussion came up that Biden didn't bring it back to something that he talked about earlier in the debate, which was Trump not making a deal with Pelosi about COVID relief, because that seems to kind of illustrate something that Biden is trying to communicate to the American people. And I think that would have been a better source of evidence for him, instead of just saying oh, the Republican Congress made it impossible for me to do anything, but to kind of prove that it's hard for any leader to get things done. And you can't be on your high horse about me not doing anything when a lot of people are dying and you aren't passing relief and people are losing their jobs and you're not making these deals.
I think Biden was in a darned if he does, darned if he doesn't position on the question of what he had done or not done in the past 47 years. If he said, well, I was just one senator of 100 all those years, and I was just the vice president during the 8 years, Trump could have said, well, gee whiz, why didn't then, he would have looked as if he was saying, yet he was admitting his own weakness and ineffectiveness.
Yeah, I agree. I thought he could have done much, Vice President Biden could have done much better on this point, especially for how many times it came up. And it seemed that he was trying to get his footing and never quite did. There were some moments where he would respond and say, "We did," and he would start listing some of the accomplishments. And I think that would have been the route to focus on more and consistently. And then, in all likelihood, then the president might look silly for continuing to keep mentioning it when the vice president continues to come up with these list of items. I thought, I thought it was interesting that this attack has been made before, and previously, we all know the answer during the Obama administration why a lot of things didn't get passed. It's because the Republican Congress refused to discuss any proposals that were being put forth. And I always wondered why they didn't actually make that point, but I think it may have been answered in that debate, because in the context of a debate in a short format like that, how can you explain that to the American people? And he tried. He made his quip and said, "There's a Republican Congress, Republican Senate." It did not, to me, land very well. Personally, I disagree a little with Casey. I didn't think Trump's retort on "you have to make deals" went off that great either. I just think the entire exchange was kind of not great for either of them. But I do think it was probably Biden's weakest area was responding to that point.
I think there was mistakes on both sides on that. If you're Joe Biden, you say we took over during the worst economic decline in the history of the country since the Great Depression, and look at all these jobs we created, and you basically inherited our recovery. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just saying that's what he should have said. And then on, the Trump side is, and I thought this was a mistake in his leadership too. When you're in a crisis, whether it's this or 9/11, you have the ability as president to gather both parties around you and rally the country, right? So you fight with Nancy Pelosi and you fight with Chuck Schumer, but when you're president, you could just grab both of them and bring them to the White House when the CARES Act passes and say, we just passed trillions of dollars in relief. And during the debate say, yeah, look, Nancy and I we don't agree on everything, but we came together and that's what leadership is. And we passed this great act. And instead of what you did, Joe, which was send money to the states for shovel-ready projects that never happened, we sent money to people's bank accounts. And we put this PPP money into companies and bank accounts and kept people working and sent them checks directly. And I did that with Nancy and Chuck, and we did it together. And that's what real leadership is. So I think they both had big missed opportunities on that.
George, I think you're spot on. And I've toyed around with this thought that you have crystallized in my mind here. Is that I don't understand why there hasn't been more of a conversation around the response to a crisis like 9/11, where George Bush was capable of getting everyone but one representative to vote for the Patriot Act.
Right.
And now there are debates about whether or not they wanted to vote for that or should have voted for it now, but he was capable of doing that. And so why aren't we contextualizing, and thinking about Democrats and Joe Biden, why is not contextualizing that moment in February and March as an opportunity and responsibility for the president to do, as you have suggested, George, to bring both parties together to respond to this crisis and to point to points in times in history where presidents have been able to successfully do that.
Yeah. And I think, Ed, he did it. And I give credit to Nancy Pelosi and Schumer and McConnell and everyone, because Marco Rubio, everyone worked together, but he's not taking credit for it. Right. And he didn't embrace the optics. Right. I mean, if I'm president in that situation, I have Pelosi and Schumer standing behind me in the Rose Garden. And then where's the oxygen for the Democrats? Right. You don't beat George W. Bush right after 9/11. Right. You don't beat George H.W. Bush after the Iraq invasion. Right. Because the nation rallied around him and they both grabbed hold of the other party. But President Trump he's combative, and he had a chance to take a big victory lap and make it very difficult for the Democrats to find their footing.
I mean, it also goes back to him never wanting to admit that he's wrong, because he dug his heels in so hard and that COVID didn't exist. And to be honest, he could have about faced on that much quicker than he thought. And he could have, to your point, taken credit for the CARES Act and all the, subsequent bipartisanship or whatever. And he could have been in the forefront of that. And he kept trying to make this point last night about it should have been 2.2 million, but it's only 200,000. But there's two issues with that. First is that he's never expressed empathy on the 200,000. And that's why that argument never resonates with anyone with him, because he doesn't care about those 200,000 and any life lost. People look to the president to be empathetic. And then the secondary component of it is that he kept going off about saying COVID is fake. And even when he had COVID, he still kept downplaying it. And then he's saying that people are just dealing with it. I mean, it's just continual with him that he's really dug his heels in on this. And that's fundamentally, he could have made himself Teflon for this election. I mean, he could have just run away with it, but he's his own worst enemy a lot of the time.
I also think some of the problem is him trying to paint himself as the anti-establishment guy. And so it's a little bit hard for him to both be that guy and also have Nancy Pelosi standing behind him and celebrating a deal that they made together, because so much of his presence is about combating the establishment that's already in Washington. And so it seems like it would be hard for him to paint himself as that guy in the debates and also talk about this passing the CARES Act that, I mean, they all did get done, but kind of goes against this image that he's trying to portray.
I agree. I think his strategy was really poor on COVID generally, which is super surprising in the sense that everybody knows it's the number one topic. How do you not have a better strategy on this topic? So, for example, it's pretty easy to just make a small pivot and say, yes, it's still here and we have a vaccine on the way, which is what he likes to talk about. And we're going to be as safe as we can. And we're going to, be careful, but we're also going to go on with our lives and open up our economy, soften the message a little bit. Instead, in his view, he has to stay all the way on his side and say, we're opening up our economy. We can't let this control us. And he doesn't soften it whatsoever. And people are left thinking, this does not sound logical. This does not sound smart. This does not, as Joe Biden puts it, this is not a plan. And I think just with some small tweaks that the message could come across much better. So I think it was poor strategy. The other thing that they seem to be banking on a lot, which I have never understood, is this comparison to H1N1, which if I was them, I would never want to put up America's memory of H1N1 versus their memory of COVID, because you're going to lose that one 100 times out of 100. Nobody's going to be like, oh yeah, H1N1 was horrible. And whatever nuances he wants to draw, that's not going to land the punch that he wants to. I think they could have done a lot better on the COVID issues.
I think it shows that success is a poor teacher. What he did in 2016, going back to the senator's point, was that he was the anti-establishment guy. He was himself, and he would say things that were shocking to the media. But I remember thinking at the time he was doing this was that, he says a lot of things that a lot of people think, but have the good sense not to say. And he's going to make a connection with a lot of those people. And he's trying to do the same thing here. And in the face of something as blatantly huge as COVID, it doesn't work as well.
I agree with that. I'd also say that I don't think that Vice President Biden did great on COVID either. I don't have a sense. I mean, he keeps saying the president's got to have a plan, but what's his plan? We're going to encourage people to wear masks and we're going to have rapid testing. Give me some details on the rapid testing piece. Are you going to tell me that it's going to be like South Korea? I'm going to walk down the street. There's going to be a stand. I can get a rapid test and I'll get a result in 10 minutes. Are you going to tell me that, I'll get a test, it'll be on my phone. And then when I go to a concert, I show them my phone and they know that I had a test within 12 hours. I mean, give me some specifics of what you mean when you're going to criticize the other side for not having a plan. So I didn't get that. And then when pushed on the shutdown issue, I didn't really get the sense where he was on shutdown. Are we going to have shutdowns? He's like, schools shouldn't open, businesses shouldn't open. He said, no, I'm going to shut down the virus, not shut down the country. So I think he missed an opportunity there. If you're going to give us an alternative of how things should be done, then give us what the alternative is. In general, the Biden campaign, I think, has done something very smart, which is they're basically running a referendum on the president. They're not coming out with specifics. They're just saying this guy's bad. I'll unite you. It's not so much different than Barack Obama when he said hope and change, which everybody's for hope and change, without a lot of specifics. So I think that's has been a smart campaign strategy. But when you're in a debate like this, if you're going to say their plan is bad, then, and you're going to say, I've got a plan, it would be nice to hear some details of what the plan is.
Well, I do think he was alluding to the fact that the DOE doesn't have any sort of guidance for schools to reopen. And he did have a quip, Biden did have a quip about teachers dying and how they shouldn't be collateral damage. And then he also did describe how restaurants and businesses could adapt. I don't think he went into as much detail as you're obviously asking for, but I think the Trump administration has just, I mean, their task force, I don't know what they're doing. And I don't know if they're doing anything. It seems to be, they think the spikes will handle themselves. But I mean, I think he thinks we need to do more. And I also think that Trump starts saying that countries around the world are looking to us for our COVID response. I mean, that's just not true. I mean, New Zealand, there's plenty of other countries that are leading the charge and actually have infection rates decreasing or like 0 infections per day, and we're still breaking records. So I don't necessarily think it was a wash on the COVID point. I definitely think Biden was way ahead of that, but I think COVID is very hard to distill in debate points, and it's also science. And the average American doesn't have a science degree. And I think that's a huge part of this. Is we're dealing with a global pandemic. We're not dealing with a terrorist threat. And that's why post 9/11, it was so easy to rally behind, you know, that other. But when the other is the germ, it doesn't work as well.
Yeah, the way in which I think about this portion of not only this debate, but the way in which this campaign is unfolding, is that I think of President Trump and that campaign going for the vaccine counterplan with the shutdown DA as the net benefit. And that doesn't really seem like such a terrible strategy to me when viewed in a vacuum, but people don't trust the EV set that's being produced. And that if, and I think it gets to the point that many of you have made, that a tweak in rhetorical strategies in March and April, in the way in which this is talked about, in having some notion or rhythms of empathy, that if he said to Bob Woodward and said that to the American public, I think that we are in an entirely different place. And that's what's so weird to me about this, that conversation that he had with Bob Woodward, I came away thinking that, wow, the president understands this, is on top of it, understands the reality and seriousness of it, but instead decided to go in a different direction on how communicating with the public. And it feels like that was the wrong direction, and it's impacting the rhetorical strategy now and its effectiveness.
Here, something that Melissa taught us specifically, hi Melissa, the importance of research comes in. If Trump had been listening to his people, and I'm sure there are good, knowledgeable people there, he might have pointed to Sweden's experience, in which their response has been pretty much to not shut down and to let things ride. And we see them with one of the lowest COVID impacts in the world. If you research history to the 1918 pandemic, in 1920, according to the US Census, the population of the United States was 106 million. It probably had been greater during the pandemic when a lot of people died and the population may have gone down by 1920. Now, in that pandemic, 675,000 Americans died, with a population less than a third of ours now. And with, you know, actual bits of data like that, he may very well have mitigated the damage a lot.
Can I give you this observation? Think about this alternative history, and especially if Vice President Biden wins. Imagine that, to your point, Ed, in that first 2 months, there's a pivot. President realizes, boy, this is not going away by Easter. This is going to be a disaster. He's on TV every week, kind of a la Cuomo in New York, talking to the American people from the Oval Office, gathering Democrats and Republicans together, and we're working, giving constant updates. This is what we're going to do. It's terrible. It's strong, still could be we're not going to shut down as much as maybe some would like, but at empathetic, we're all in this together, wartime, like we're at wartime. There's no election, right? This is like FDR running for re-election during World War II, right? The Democrats, we've got zero traction. And that's just, we could have had the same results. I mean, I don't know what the answer is of how many more people would have died or how many less people would have died, but it's all about the approach. And if that approach was taken, I think this is a going away election for the president.
100%. I agree with you. I think we are talking landslide of monumental proportions. I think that we are having conversations about consolidating the Senate and even having some coattails that takes back the House. I fundamentally agree with you that it would be that substantial of a sea change. I want to shift the conversation just a little bit to another topic, but I think that it centers around the same sort of framing and rhetorical strategy issue. While I would not advise the president to say that he has been the best president for Black America since Abraham Lincoln, that the hubris and as a rhetorical device, it just doesn't seem to work well. There are things that he has done that are significant and substantial in its impact, whether it's extending long-term funding for HBCUs that didn't occur with the Obama administration or before, the First Step Act that created prison reform and released a tremendous number of people from prison, lots of them Black folks on drug violations, and the opportunity zones that have, before we had the pandemic, was boosting economies and could take credit for doing that. And yet, those things don't seem to be helping in shifting the numbers when it comes to Black voters. Why? Why the disconnect? What do you hypothesize is preventing him from translating those issues into votes?
I think he goes into a fight or flight response whenever he's criticized for anything. And when you're in a fight or flight response, you have a raw knee-jerk reaction to go, "Hurr." And it's sometimes difficult to step back and think and put together a coherent response to what the countervailing assertion is.
I also think that he has a tendency to not empathize with people, kind of what we were talking about, and then express what he's done, like funding HBCUs on the First Step Act, as look what I did for you, instead of thinking about the unique experiences of all Americans and how this kind of can change the experiences that Americans have. And instead of making it more of a piece of his, a way to kind of bring more people into his base and to show that he actually cares about regular American people, he's using it as a strategy to be like, but look what I did.
I view his little reforms, they're not little. I mean, I view these accomplishments as his way of saying, I have Black friends. Like, they're ornamental. You know that he's not the driver, he's not the architect. He didn't come into a meeting and say, this is what we should do. Kim Kardashian comes to his office and says, oh, you can do this. And there are instances where he exerts very little political capital, where he doesn't have to do anything really except sign something. There are issues that already have bipartisan support, and he knows that it'll create this sort of Christmas tree effect of ornaments around him, while he then does, fundamentally catastrophic things that hurt, populations of color and middle America, like the tax bill, and then he uses racist rhetoric. I mean, their kids in cages. Like, it's fundamentally inconsistent. And I don't think the Black community I think they're intelligent, and they see that, and they view Joe Biden as an ally. And they think that those things that Trump did, Joe Biden will do, and also do more systemic things that will will help society as a whole. So, I mean, that's where I just don't think he's getting traction. But Trump especially doesn't gain traction with Black women. There are Black men who have changed their vote for him. So it's an interesting dynamic.
What I find interesting about that perspective, Casey, I don't disagree with it. I don't understand why it doesn't get applied to Joe Biden as well. And that's the piece of this that I find fascinating from a rhetoric perspective, communication perspective, politics perspective, the discussion of the crime bill, even the discussion of busing, where Joe Biden was opposed to those things. And yet that doesn't seem to stick to him and doesn't seem to be part of the conversation of his lore and engagement with Black communities. And yet, when talking about Donald Trump, there are those other things that's there. And so to me, I'm wondering, what is it that encourages us to read one candidate in one particular way and the other in another way? And maybe you've sort of spoken to that a little bit, but
I think the better question though is, I mean, and this is going back to the primary, but why after that first debate when Joe Biden was against busing and Kamala was like, I was one of those bus students, why was she not then given the support of the Black community? That's what I never understood. And that's what hurts my brain. It doesn't hurt my brain when the Black community goes to Biden versus Trump because, come on. But that initially was like, there was a woman, a person of color, and I mean, there was also Cory Booker. So I don't know, maybe the Black community was being more strategic. Maybe they were seeing the forest for the trees. They never coalesced around Bernie. They didn't give Liz that support. I don't think Klobuchar really had a chance, and especially what happened later on with police brutality, it just was not in the cards for her. But that's the fundamental question that I have trouble answering, that I can't deconstruct. And I've spoken to like my friends who are Black, and they always were like Biden over her, and I just was like, really, like I couldn't understand it. And this is not scientific, this is just social conversation.
Sure.
But she was always my candidate. When he picked her as VP, I was ecstatic. I mean, I love her. She's just amazing. But yeah, I don't know. But that's a question that really hurts my brain, not the Trump versus Biden thing. I mean, I don't really think it's a contest, but I understand that. Yeah, his accomplishments on those fronts do get sort of pushed to the side. And I think it all has to do with how he phrases them. He says, I'm the best, I'm the least racist person in the room. And he doesn't even know who's in the room. It's beyond. It's like the hubris of it. Really? Like, come on.
I think for me, it's about context. And right or wrong, you can the average person can tell a story with Joe Biden of progression, of change, of learning. I think that most people have examples of people like that in their own lives, or they see how people have evolved over time. People often talk, it seems to be every single generation talks about their super old family members who say crazy racist things or whatever. And each generation goes by and it still seems to be the case, even though we're as a society, we're still changing. That seems to not change. And so Joe Biden over 47 years, in that context, you can understand that someone can change. And also you can see what he's done more recently in his career, not in the 80s, not in the 90s, but during the Obama administration, for example, and more recently, and say, yeah, look, he's earnestly talked about these issues, he's earnestly advocated for these issues, and he's actually made some changes. Whereas President Trump, those legislative wins that you cited, Ed, are the only examples he has. And even in that context, that's not what he talks about when he talks about how Black voters should vote for him. He always goes number one to jobs, which really is, he in his mind, he created a good economy, and that created jobs for everyone, which means by definition, I guess not by definition, but it also rising waters, rise all boats, whatever the expression is. And that's what he cites. He very rarely, I think, at least that I've heard, talks about HBCU funding and criminal justice reform. He did last night, but generally he's only talking about jobs and pointing to that example. And I think it's just not a believable story that he has changed from his own history that is also not great on race.
Here, research comes into play again here. And maybe Trump's people told him this, but looking at the long view, when Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society, now some almost 50 years ago, 90% of Black children grew up in a home with a mother and a father who were married to each other. Now, I think a lot of Black people put weight on the government programs that were launched to help them. But over that time, in the face of all of that help, Black families have disintegrated, and a clear majority of Black children now grow up in one-parent homes. And if he could make a counter argument that what the other side has done has not worked and in fact has been harmful in some ways, he could make some traction.
Rodney, I'm with you. I have long said that absent the Southern strategy, that it feels like to me, someone who's been Black my entire life and know a lot of Black folks who are my family members, that the value system of those folks seem more closely aligned with the Republican Party than it does the Democrat Party. And that's one of the other things that's baffling about for me in thinking about politics and the centrality of communication and narratives that it plays. Because when thinking about individual responsibility, thinking about the notion of religion and the role that it plays in communities, that there is a significant attraction that I would think would be there, but it doesn't seem. It's not that it doesn't seem to be, it's definitely not there. And that's one of the challenges that I think that needs to be wrestled with and addressed and thought about.
I think it's a fascinating point you both bring up. And I think that this election, because the president is such a big polarizing figure, we're not seeing the way the trends are playing out in this country with the realignment of voters. So I think that this election masks what's happening underneath, and that when we get back to, a post-Trump world, whether that's now or 4 years from now, you're going to continue to see these shifts where the parties become something different than what they were. So, Donald Trump is not a traditional Republican in any stretch. There's things he's more aligned with traditional Democratic values on than Republicans, being a protectionist, for example, right? So you're going to see, I think, when there are other players on the stage, some realignment, like you saw in the last election where working class whites who had always voted Democratic voted for Trump because he talked about issues like immigration and loss of manufacturing overseas that appeal to them. Here in Florida, where I'm from, our Republican governor, it's estimated, because he can't exactly know, but it's estimated from exit polling, got 19% of African-American women to vote for him again when he ran against an African-American candidate. Now, why is that? Because Andrew Gillum came out against school choice. And the thinking is that Black moms who've put their kids in charter schools have said, this is the best thing for my children, and you're going to shut down that option. So when we take Trump out of the equation, which will happen either now or in 4 years, we should not be surprised to see realignments. I mean, in fact, I think the Republican Party is transforming. If Trump gets reelected, it will become a Trump party. If he doesn't get reelected, it may revert to something of a hybrid between a Trump party and what Republicans used to be. And the Democratic Party is transforming. So this happens every 50, 60 years in this country. Remember, Republicans were pushing civil rights in the 1960s, and Democrats were against it, right? Republicans were a New England party. Now you have one member of Congress elected from New England who's a Republican, and she may lose, Susan Collins, right? So America changes, and we change geographically, we change regionally, our parties reinvent themselves, and with technology and how fast the world is changing, we shouldn't be surprised to see parties change in a very quick fashion and accelerating fashion over time.
Instead of just a two-party realignment, though, I have thought for the past 6 years, so we're probably going to see potentially the rise of a multi-party. And I think that is not being instigated by the Green Party or the Libertarians, which we've always thought would be the origin of that multi-party system, but by actually the left side of the Democratic Party. You have people in the Democratic Party who are Bernie or bust, who are AOC or bust. They do not want to see a moderate win, and they are so against Biden as a centrist that they want to vote for Trump and will vote for Trump and go on social media and talk and pump him up and say that, he's better because he reveals the cracks in the system, or they're actually advocating almost anarchy in a sense, which is, I think, from an extreme place of privilege. You see most of these trust funders who, have 30K social media jobs living in their parents' Hamptons house on a trust estate. But regardless, it's having a profound impact on the American political system and also on the media. The media is amplifying this and making certain candidates have more of a chance than ordinarily. I mean, Mayor Pete, really? This guy was the mayor of a town that's smaller than the first district that Obama was a state senator from. It's beyond, but that's the world we live in now. And I think we have to adapt and change to it. I mean, and unfortunately, the census is a huge part of that as well. And that's becoming politicized, which is beyond, because that should never be politicized.
I also think your example, Senator, shows the problem in developing a strategy as a candidate based on an identity category, and shows that you have to take into account the complexities of people's policy preferences and advocate for policy preferences that are shown with data to be supported by groups that you're interested in attracting, instead of just assuming if I talk about this one policy, then I'll get the African-American vote, because there's no such thing as the woman vote or the African-American vote, and people have different policy preferences. And so I think both candidates often run into that problem of focusing on identity categories instead of specific policies that are data-driven to show to attract groups of people they're interested in acquiring.
We have 7 minutes remaining. I have one final question for each of you. That, as you've demonstrated in our time together, you're masterful communicators. And what piece of advice would you offer to folks who are watching this live and who will watch a video of this on what could they do to improve the way in which they communicate? What could they do to improve being a debater? Take either one of those. How do I get better at communicating, or how do I get better at being a debater?
Nowadays, the quote unquote debating that I do, if you could call it that, I'd like to call it more deliberation and dialogue, is with mothers with their babies and the question of will they get them immunized. And I could come at them and go, Dr. Wakefield in England was on the payroll of the London Aid Society, which was pursuing litigation against families who had children with autism after they got MMR, and so on and so forth. But if I slow down and calm down and empathize with the mothers and their concerns, and, develop a rapport with them, it's easier for me to reason with them as to why they should get their children immunized.
I agree with that, and similar to the advice that I would give. In that, back in my debate days, the goal was always winning. And part of that can be persuasion, right? When you have a lot of clash on a specific argument, you do have to convince the judge that you're on the right side of that. But it's not always about persuasion necessarily. Sometimes sometimes there are other factors that go there. Outside of a competition, really persuasion is the name of the game. And as you just said, I think it's about empathy. And really put simply, as I would tell my 5-year-old niece, put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand where they're coming from. And that's really important, because then you'll understand what you need to do in order to persuade them. What is their level of understanding on the topic that you're discussing? And then you can adjust your arguments. Do I need to discuss at a higher level? Do I need to discuss at a technical level in order to convince them that this is the right, that I'm on the right side of things? And so judge adaptation is something we always talked about in debate, and that still exists. The judge is just who is actually in most cases in normal life is your opponent, is your the person you're talking to. Your opponent is your partner in conversation. And so you got to think about where they're coming from and adapt your arguments that way.
I totally agree. And I think that in my life right now, the debates or the dialogue between me and my friends is mostly trying to persuade people to vote that are kind of disillusioned with Biden, but we're maybe Bernie people. And I think that really putting yourself in their shoes and trying to identify issues that they care about and explain why voting can change those outcomes is important in making those interpersonal relationships stronger and winning the judge, which, as you said, Cyrus, is the other person.
One of my debate partners always used to say the devil's in the details. And in my career, I mean, I work in finance, so I'm not a traditional lawyer, but it's always about nuance. It's always about finding the nuance. There's always something to look for to differentiate. And I think that when you think of, you have to make the situation as clear as possible, but differentiate your argument with the nuance. And then I think it'll be effective.
Yeah, I associate myself with all those comments. I think besides being in the courtroom and the boardroom where I want to win, my goal now is just to listen and learn and create dialogue. And I don't think it's even important that there's an outcome of the dialogue these days because dialogue's so broken. So for me, it's just having conversations and doing a lot of listening and learning. I learned a lot today. I always learn when I'm around thoughtful people who are trying to make their community better. So we've really broken this country with the lack of civility, debate, discourse, and we got to do a much better job. So that's why I love debate. That's one of the best things that debate taught us, because we had to debate both sides, right? So we learned there's good arguments on both sides. And I support this debate initiative here in Broward County where I live, where we've got more public school kids debating now than any place in the country. We got homeless kids debating. We got kids in juvenile detention debating. And we all know the power of what debate does for you, right? How it changes your life. It certainly changed mine. So I think we just have to listen and encourage conversations, because the social media, for all of its benefits, has created these silos that people live in and where they're reinforced, and they don't want to talk and listen. And you never learn anything if you're not listening.
At the bottom of the Alumni Memorial University Center is the squad room. And before you get to the squad room, there are a line of pictures, and all of these folks are there. Maggie will be there very soon. And I would have spent today in that squad room having this conversation with our students. What was going on in the debate? What did you think? How is this going to unfold? And I haven't been able to be in the squad room since March, because all of the work is taking place here and we have a limited number of students on the campus. And the thing that I find most valuable and rewarding about being a part of the Barkley Forum is that the conversation that I just had the honor and pleasure of having with you 5 amazing people is the same type of conversation I would have had with students if I was able to be on the campus. That is the magic of debate. That is the magic of the Barkley Forum, that people from generations, different political perspectives, different genders, different races can come together based upon the beauty of debate, deliberation, and dialogue, and a relish in sharing opinions and perspectives and the opportunity to learn from each other. So thank you for hanging out in the squad room with me this evening. And I look forward to our next conversations that we're able to have together. And on that, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everyone.